This video is brought to you by World of Warships. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, in the field of conflict during the Second World War, one ship's destruction has now reached legendary status and continues to puzzle experts to this day. That ship was, of course, the HMS Hood. Hood was catastrophically destroyed somehow and sank in minutes, losing almost all of her crew. But why? And how? How did a modern warship sink so dramatically in such a rudimentary engagement with the enemy? Many sources would say that Hood was poorly armoured, leaving a vulnerable Achilles heel, but as you will find out, this was not exactly true, and the real cause of the disaster may have been partly foretold by the Navy over 20 years before it actually happened. It's May 1941, and the mighty battlecruiser HMS Hood is steaming through a dreary, cold sea alongside the newly commissioned battleship Prince of Wales. They are on a special mission to intercept and engage a powerful enemy force which threatens to break out into the Atlantic and hunt down crucial Allied merchant ships, which are providing a lifeline to the British people. 2 German warships had been spotted on May 23rd in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, so Hood and Prince of Wales set off in pursuit. Now all eyes on Hood's bridge were glued to the horizon, keeping lookout for the enemy. Then, at 5:37 AM on the 24th, there came a call. 2 ships had been spotted in the distance. Slowly, their ghostly presence came into focus and recognition. They were German. One was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and the other, the battleship Bismarck. Bismarck is a ship which has a lot of myth and hyperbole attached to it, so here are the facts. The ship, along with its sister, Tirpitz, was the most powerful German warship afloat. All warships are built with very specific roles and purposes in mind, guided by their navy's doctrine and the expected theatre of operations. Bismarck and Tirpitz were designed and built to engage and sink enemy warships in relatively close-range engagements in the North Sea. These were Germany's home waters, and the designers specifically had the fast, French Richelieu-class battleships in mind as an adversary. Bismarck and Tirpitz would need to engage enemy battleships and receive multiple hits and keep going. A whole 40% of Bismarck's combat weight was dedicated to protecting the warship from enemy fire, which is a huge number, comparatively speaking, to other warships from the time. They were built to be fast, with a top speed of 30 knots, ideal for engaging the enemy and slipping away if necessary. Curiously though, although Bismarck was designed to go toe-to-toe with enemy battleships, its guns were of a relatively small caliber, 380mm or 15-inch main guns, which fired a fairly lightweight armor-piercing round. In a full broadside, Bismarck could send 14,112 pounds, or 6,400 kilograms of projectiles at the enemy. But by contrast, some World War I era battleships could send up to 16,800 pounds downrange. And contrary to popular belief, in the Second World War, 51 battleships could fire a broadside heavier than that of Bismarck. But with the outbreak of the Second World War, the Bismarck's intended use changed because the Kriegsmarine changed its battle plan. Germany had rushed to rearm in the lead up to World War II, building as many tanks, aircraft and warships as they could, but Britain's navy was the largest in the world at the time. By September 1939, in European waters where Germany could field 3 battleships, the Royal Navy could respond with 9. Germany's Kriegsmarine had 7 cruisers, but the Royal Navy had 35, and the number of destroyers was an even more dramatic contrast. Germany had 22, but the British had 95. Germany's leadership knew that they couldn't compete with the Royal Navy in the same way that they had during the First World War, so they shifted their tactics. Instead of engaging British capital ships toe-to-toe, the Kriegsmarine would leverage its warships and powerful submarine fleet to hunt the greatest prize of all, British merchant shipping. The lifeblood of the island nation during wartime, if the Kriegsmarine could sink enough merchant ship convoys, then Britain might starve. Bismarck and Tirpitz were assigned new roles. They would not seek out British battleships for a fight. Instead, they would use their speed to slip out into the Atlantic Ocean and hunt down Allied cargo ships. It was a role for which the Bismarck was not originally intended, but for which she was still very well suited. Other German battleships operated in the same way. In January 1941, the sister ships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst slipped out into the North Atlantic Ocean and hunted merchant shipping as a pair. In 2 months, they sank or captured 22 Allied merchant ships. Bismarck was still being completed and tested then, but by May 1941, she was ready. Commanded by none other than senior-ranking Admiral and Kriegsmarine Fleet Chief Günther Lütjens, Bismarck was paired with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen and given its orders. The ships would sneak out from Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, and steam high over the British Isles and Iceland to avoid detection. Then, free in the North Atlantic Ocean, the warships could mercilessly hunt down Allied shipping to their heart's content. It was called Operation Rheinübung. On May 19, 1941, Bismarck made steam and set off on her mission. Not surprisingly, the British weren't so keen on learning from passing Swedish ships and their crews that Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were leaving the protection of their home ports for the open ocean, because it could mean only one thing, that another merchant raid was underway and their ships were in danger. They had to be stopped in their tracks. British and Allied lives depended on it. There are only a couple of likely routes that the Germans could use. The English Channel was the most direct way out into the Atlantic, but it's far too narrow and was patrolled constantly by British aircraft and warships. To the British, the most likely route seemed up north in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. To that spot, they directed the British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, while further south, a powerful force of 2 capital ships and 6 destroyers would patrol off Iceland to catch the German ships if they were detected. The British capital ships were 2 of the most powerful afloat in European waters. They were the brand new HMS Prince of Wales and the older HMS Hood. I mentioned that Bismarck was designed with a specific purpose in mind, and so too was Hood. Prince of Wales, like Bismarck, was a battleship, designed to slog it out with enemy warships and keep on sailing, but Hood was different. She was officially designated not as a battleship, but as a battle cruiser, a class of ship whose origins stem from the First World War, and which was designed to serve a completely different role to that of the battleship. Instead of slogging it out with the enemy battleships like a prize boxer, Hood and the other battle cruisers like her were designed for speed, aiming to chase enemy fleets and nip at them with their powerful battleship-caliber guns. The point was to have a ship as powerful as a battleship, but with the speed of a cruiser, hence the name, battlecruiser. But Hood was a huge ship for its day. As built, she displaced some 41,000 odd tons and was 860 feet or 262 meters in length. How do you get so big a warship to operate at speeds up to 32 knots? Well, one way to do this is to lengthen the hull. Typically, battlecruisers were longer than battleships because a longer hull form reduces drag through the water and lends itself to a higher top speed. But a second key factor in hitting higher speeds is to simply reduce the weight of the ship. Battlecruisers weren't expected to slog it out with enemy battleships, so armor protection could be shaved here and there to save on weight. Now, some myths exist around this today. Contrary to modern popular history, battlecruisers weren't unarmored at all. They were still some of the most well-protected warships afloat. For instance, the formidable dreadnought battleship Queen Elizabeth featured belt waterline armor on her sides that was 13 inches or 330 millimeters thick, while Hood's waterline belt armor was 12 inches or 304 millimeters thick, angled outwards to increase its relative thickness. In fact, 31% of Hood's total mass was dedicated to armor protection, as opposed to Queen Elizabeth's 29%. Hood's deck armor plating has come under scrutiny after her loss, but the fact is that key lessons had been learned following the First World War, and her design had been changed to reflect this. At the Battle of Jutland on May 31st, 1916, 3 British battlecruisers famously catastrophically sank after receiving direct hits from German guns. Inquiries blamed poor propellant storing procedures for the magazine detonations, but some thought was given to the lighter nature of the battlecruiser's deck armor. It was thought that this could prove an Achilles heel at long range when shellfire arcs downwards to strike a warship, not from the side, but from above. Hood, which had only just been laid down, had design changes made that would see her be much better protected than the other British battlecruisers. Her deck armor was increased in some places by as much as 0.3 inches or 10 millimeters, and her belt armor was also thickened from an average intended 5.3 inches or 135 millimeters to an average of 8 inches or 203 millimeters. The slight changes meant that Hood's deck armor and belt armor was actually quite well protected from the shell caliber of choice for newer German battleships, 15 inches or 38 centimeters. Hood was so relatively well protected that many considered her to be kind of a fast battleship rather than a battle cruiser. Now, Hood wasn't just any old warship. She was beloved by the general public and had become an ambassador for the Royal Navy. She was, for about 20 years, the world's largest warship, and therefore a serious object of curiosity during peacetime. She visited many international ports, including my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, seen here. It's difficult to imagine a time when the general public could crawl over what was then the most advanced and modern warship afloat, but there they are. Known as the Mighty Hood, the ship was a household name in the lands of the British Empire and the Commonwealth, nothing short of a floating celebrity. By the Second World War's outbreak, she was somewhat dated, but she'd had components modernized and could still cause serious problems for the enemy. She was fast, she hit hard, and her crew were highly motivated. They weren't just on any ship, they were aboard the Mighty Hood. Now, just before we go on, a quick word of thanks to today's sponsor. If you've enjoyed looking at the 3D models that I used to animate this video, then we've got World of Warships to thank. The team have created dozens of highly accurate and realistic models of famous warships from history for their game. I'm actually really excited to talk about this game because I've been personally playing it for 7 years now. In it, you can take command of mighty battleships and battle cruisers like Bismarck and Hood and engage enemy players in epic naval battles. It's fun and addictive and a really valuable educational source because you can even reveal the armor schemes of famous warships and see how they were built. Follow the link on the screen or in the description of this video to get free goodies when you sign up. You'll get 500 gold doubloons, the in-game currency, 7 days of free premium account, 2 million credits which you can buy ships and modules with, and your very own premium tier 4 ship with a skilled commander to captain it. The game's free to play, so head to worldofwarships.com today to take command of your ship and start playing. On May 24th, 1941, the fateful day Bismarck and Hood met, all seemed normal aboard the British warships. The British cruiser force had been tailing Bismarck and Prince Eugen for some time, relaying their movements to Hood and Prince of Wales. British crewmen were at action stations and the mood was tense. They knew that soon they would be engaging the enemy, but when? Suddenly, there they were. On the horizon, a patch of oil smoke finally revealed 2 German warships. They had successfully intercepted the German force. Now, they would have to stop them. Hood and Prince of Wales' guns turned around to face. It was 5:37 in the morning, but already the British had made a misstep. Instead of maneuvering to get in front of the German ships, Admiral Holland in the HMS Hood had kept to his course for just too long, meaning the Germans were getting ahead of the British ships. Soon the Germans would be able to bring all of their guns to bear on the British, while Hood and Prince of Wales could answer only with their forward gun turrets. This is a maneuver known as crossing the T. Admiral Lancelot Holland, commander of the British force aboard Hood, had a decision to make. Tail Bismarck and wait for backup in the form of the nearby battleship King George V and some other ships under the command of Admiral John Tovey, or engage the enemy now, and he chose the latter. At 5:52 AM, Hood fired the first shots of the engagement at a range of about 22 kilometers or 14 miles, and Prince of Wales fired a minute later. The Battle of the Denmark Strait had begun. Holland initially ordered his ships to target the lead German ship, but realized it wasn't Bismarck, but actually the smaller Prinz Eugen. Prinz Eugen, with cruiser-caliber guns, could damage the British battleships, but could not penetrate their armor and ultimately kill them. Bismarck was the far more dangerous target, so fire priority was concentrated on it. Prince of Wales scored first blood. One shell hit the German ship's seaplane catapult and put it out of action. A second shell passed straight through the bow without exploding, but a third detonated under the waterline and began to flood the Bismarck's forward compartments. This was good gunnery from Prince of Wales, but unfortunately, her forward gun turret fired only one salvo before becoming inoperable, and it was out of action for the remainder of the engagement. The German ships had so far remained silent, but at 5:55 they both fired at Hood, and Bismarck's guns achieved remarkable precision. On the opening salvo, the British flagship was bracketed by German shells, but on the second or third salvo she was hit, and the fire was started on the boat deck that grew by the minute. It's most likely that this hit came not from Bismarck, but the Prinz Eugen, whose smaller caliber guns were ideal for nipping at the British ship and causing damage to its deck equipment. Now flames were licking at the base of the ship's mainmast, fueled by detonating ammunition lockers. It was 6 AM, and even though Hood was on fire, she was still a formidable fighting force. And aboard Prince of Wales, men on the ship's port side who weren't yet engaged in the action watched Hood as she fired her guns and burned. The salvo from Bismarck roared in and crashed all around Hood. Both sides had drawn blood in the engagement, but it was the British gunfire that had so far caused the most damage. But then, something horrifying happened. Hood blew up. A sheet of flame suddenly erupted from below the ship's mainmast, searing high up into the sky, and then, with a dull roar, it was rent apart by a massive explosion and disappeared into a pall of smoke. The men on both Prince of Wales and the German ships watched in awe as Hood simply ceased to be. 1 second ago, she was like a vast floating town, almost 1,000 feet long and crammed with just over 1,400 men. But now Hood had been blasted in two, and her bow section was ripped up clear out of the water. Half a mile away, Prince of Wales was peppered with splinters of metal and light debris from her comrade's wreck. Like a vast cathedral, Hood's bow was lifted hundreds of feet into the air, shrouded in smoke and flame. Then, just 3 minutes after the explosion, she was gone. Hood was no more. Prince of Wales had to make an emergency change to course to avoid the burning wreck of her fleetmate. The ship now found itself alone against the combined fire of Prinz Eugen and Bismarck. The shells rained down all around her. She was now less than 14 kilometers away from the enemy, with one main turret out of action. The results were not good. She was hit 7 times from both ships in various locations and suffered casualties because of it. Bismarck's captain wanted to chase the British ship down and finish her off, but Operations Commander Admiral Lutyens refused to give his permission. Bismarck's orders were to avoid the Royal Navy at all costs. The British ships slipped away and the Germans pressed on with their mission. And as they did, Hood was already on its way to the sea floor. Up on the surface, only 3 men clung together on a raft and awaited rescue. 1,415 men were lost with their ship. So, what had happened? How could a mighty fighting ship be reduced to flaming wreckage in mere seconds? The Navy was shocked by the incident and had to find out as soon as possible what had happened lest a similar fate befall any of their other warships on strength. Only one thing could cause an explosion of that magnitude: the violent detonation of the ship's ammunition magazines. But what had set off the magazines and how? Eyewitnesses from Prince of Wales recalled shots seen straddling Hood seconds before she went up. So the most obvious answer was that a shell from Bismarck's salvo had not hit the sea around Hood but plunged through her armour and exploded within the confines of the powder magazine. An inquiry was launched, and right away, Hood's armour protection was placed under scrutiny. The Battle of Jutland was fresh in the minds of Navy planners and senior authorities. But why did Hood suffer a similar fate to the battle cruisers lost at Jutland when her armour had been reinforced specifically to avoid this kind of destruction? Now, at the inquiry and in the decades since, the prevailing theory had been that plunging fire was to blame. That Bismarck, engaging from a distance, had her shells fired high in the air to drop down on Hood, plunging through her deck armour from above and hitting the magazines. There was one simple issue with this theory: it was that the ships were just too close. At the time Hood was lost, the range had closed to about 14 kilometres or 9 miles. In terms of naval engagements of the Second World War, this was fairly close range. By contrast, some actions in the Pacific took place at ranges out to 19 miles, or 31 kilometres. It meant that Bismarck's shells weren't curving dramatically up into the air. The trajectory was flatter, and the shells were coming in not directly from above, but from an angle at Hood's starboard quarter. Despite this, the plunging fire hypothesis has been repeated in documentaries and books again and again, unfairly casting the Hood as a ship whose deck armour had been sacrificed for more speed, and that this lack of deck armour presented an Achilles heel. No, it was something else that sank the Hood, not plunging fire and a lack of armour. Another hypothesis involved the fire. What if it was much more serious than it had first appeared? If gasoline tanks stored near the deck had burnt, their cascading fuel could catch alight and gush through ventilation trunking and ammunition hoists into the heart of the ship, spilling into the magazines and causing a detonation. Except this seems most unlikely. Crew had secured many of the ammunition hoists and fuel tanks specifically for this very reason. With everything locked up securely, it seems the fire was confined to burn only the exterior of the ship, and in fact, just before Hood blew up, men on Prince of Wales figured the fire was dying out and would shortly be extinguished as it ran out of fuel. Hood's own supply of torpedoes was also considered as a potential source of initial detonation, and this has been repeated in the years since. The torpedoes were kept on deck in their tubes, and some thought that a hit near those torpedoes could set them off, creating an explosion powerful enough to reach Hood's magazines and cause a devastating chain reaction, leading to the loss of the ship. So compelling was the idea that the second inquiry considered it seriously and even ran tests. A torpedo similar to one carried by Hood was fired at, and any nearby hits from a 15-inch shell proved that it would not detonate. A direct hit might, but even in a fire it might take more than 20 minutes for a torpedo to burn and then explode, but even then the explosive force of the torpedo could not be enough to devastate the Hood and reach its magazines. The aft magazine was 2 decks down and 25 meters, or 82 feet further aft, well outside the explosive radius of a torpedo and well protected by armor and bulkheads. Another theory proves more tantalizing, more difficult to disprove, and is ultimately the more tragic, that Hood was somehow the agent of her own destruction. Following the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, inquiries figured that poor procedures within the battlecruiser's gun turrets and magazines had resulted in lax handling and stowage of powder and propellants. It was easier to leave access points open and leave gunpowder around outside the protective magazines because it meant your guns could fire faster. But unsecured hatches and doors and poorly placed bags of explosive meant that a hit or a single ignition point could cause a chain reaction and detonate the main powder magazines. Strict new so-called anti-flash protocols were put into place to drastically reduce this risk, and Hood and her crew adhered to them. But in the heat of battle and needing a higher fire rate, could these have been temporarily sacrificed or ignored? If bags of powder were allowed to stack up and hatches were not secure before firing, a misfire or venting of gas back into the gun turret could have set off the powder and detonated the magazine. There is eyewitness evidence to support this idea. Crewmen on Prince of Wales saw Hood's guns fire, but they did not appear quite right. Petty Officer George Henry Goff recalled that, "The next thing I noticed was that the B turret was firing, belching out flames, and after that Y turret fired on its own, and then Hood went up." He explained that when a gun fires, the flash licks slowly around the muzzle of the gun, but there was no straight flash, and the flames licked slowly round. To Goff, the type of fire coming from Hood's guns just didn't look quite right. There was something else wrong with Y turret that indicated they might have been experiencing a problem. Observers on the Prince of Wales saw the gun train toward Bismarck, lock on target, and then disengage briefly before returning to its previous position and then firing. Petty Officer Lawrence Sutton testified that Hood was firing with her foremost turrets. Y turret then trained towards the enemy, and before firing there was a flash abaft the mainmast of the Hood, which appeared to be a fire on the boat deck. Y turret then fired, and at the same time a huge flash came up all around Y turret. The flash rose to well above the mainmast of the ship, and all I heard was a tremendous roar, and I could not see anything until the smoke had cleared away. That was all I saw of the Hood. This paints a very dramatic picture. If Y turret was having internal problems, a backblast or misfire could have caused a dramatic detonation of the powder if protocols had not been properly followed during the battle. The inquiry dismissed this idea, but it's difficult to disprove because there were simply no survivors from Hood's gun turrets. Or the timing of Y turrets firing just a second before Hood detonated could have simply been a coincidence. There is one clue that leads us to another hypothesis. A direct hit from Bismarck with a clear penetration into the powder magazines, not from above and through the deck armor, but directly through Hood's hull. Somewhat disturbingly, this exact method of destruction was prophesied by the Navy some 21 years beforehand. Now, I mentioned that just after the Battle of Jutland, Hood's armor protection scheme was called into question. It was felt that her armor, 5.3 inches or 135 millimeters of average belt armor, and the same thickness of total deck armor would be insufficient to prevent clean penetration of 15-inch shells from German battleships. Hood's armor was increased, not dramatically, but sufficiently to prevent most penetrating shots. The belt from 5.3 to 8 inches, and the decks to 6.35 inches. The armor was arranged in 3 thicknesses on the belt. Towards the top of the hull, it was 5 inches. The middle belt was 7, and the lower belt, reaching just below the waterline, was a full 12 inches. Gunnery trials took place on a mock-up of Hood's new armor scheme and found that the lower belt could not be penetrated, but the middle belt could. A well-placed shot with a relatively flat trajectory could plunge through the belt armor and, if fused correctly, be timed to detonate within the confines of the powder magazine. A hit from Bismarck could have followed this exact trajectory, outlined by the Navy in 1920. Hood has often been cast as a victim of an unlucky shot, but a straight one-on-one with an enemy battleship with 15-inch guns was predicted to end badly for her by the Navy some 20 years earlier. It sounds like a case-closed argument, but it isn't. Because even though the Navy feared a penetration of the belt armor, there was still one more obstacle the offending shell would need to overcome, and calculations reveal it to be impossible: the deck armor. See, the shells landing on Hood and penetrating the upper or middle belts would then need to crash through almost 7 inches, or 180 millimeters of combined deck armor. Historian and author Bill Durans has run complex calculations and simulations on this outcome and discovered that the Bismarck's shell would not have been able to reach the powder magazine before it detonated. Striking the belt armor would cause 2 issues for the shell's path into the magazine. First, the shell would, after having punched through the belt armor, now be traveling at a much slower speed, giving it less penetrative power, making it far less likely to plunge through the deck armor and into the powder magazine. More tellingly though, contact with the belt armor would have set off the shell's fuse, leaving only 0.35 seconds before detonation of the explosive charge inside. It doesn't sound like long, but the distance from the belt armor to the inside of the powder magazine would not be sufficient, and the shell would detonate outside the confines of the magazine. So this leaves us with one final culprit, the most likely cause of Hood's loss. One of Bismarck's shells could have landed slightly short of target, plunged underwater, and penetrated below Hood's thick waterline belt and within the powder magazine. At first it seems unlikely. Surely impact with the water would slow the shell enough to prevent this kind of an impact. But it's not without precedent, because in that very same engagement, Bismarck scored an identical hit on the Prince of Wales, a hit that, if it had landed in line with the ship's powder magazines, could have resulted in a similar detonation and sinking of the second British warship that day. When Prince of Wales was dry docked for repair after the Bismarck engagement, a penetration was found deep below the waterline. The shell had hit the water first and then plunged down over 8 meters, or 26 feet deep, and here the ship's hull is very lightly armored. The shell easily punched through the Prince of Wales hull plating and drove through 4 more steel bulkheads before coming to rest within the ship. It was a dud shell, and it failed to explode. But if it wasn't a dud, and had hit Prince of Wales in line with her magazines, the results would have been catastrophic. Both Hood and Prince of Wales could have detonated within minutes of each other. This seems the most likely culprit. If one of Bismarck's shells landed slightly short of Hood's armor in line with the mainmast, it would have plunged clear below the armored belt's protection into the soft underbelly of the ship. The standard fuse delay would mean that the shell could penetrate into the after magazine and explode, igniting the powder stored within and causing a relatively slow burn of propellant. X and Y turrets' magazines between them kept just under 100 tons of cordite. If this were ignited by Bismarck's shell, it would burn fiercely, causing superheated gases to vent out violently. This could have demolished the bulkheads separating the powder magazine and the engine room, incinerating all inside. But crucially, it would have caused the geyser of flame seen by witnesses on Prince of Wales. As the gases and flame followed a path of least resistance to escape the inside of the ship, that had been vented upwards through the engine room vents at the base of the mainmast, surging high into the air. It still wasn't enough though. Hood's stern section had become something like a pressure cooker. The pressure was temporarily relieved when the gases burst into the engine rooms, but it built up again dramatically, and there could only be one outcome. The ship's hull burst at the seams and Hood exploded. Whatever the mechanism of Hood's destruction, the results were devastating. On Bismarck, the crew watched with a mix of elation and shock, proud of their victory, but instinctively feeling a sense of horror for their British counterparts. Back in Britain, Hood's loss was a devastating blow, and many recalled it as being the most shocking moment of the Second World War. Churchill and the Admiralty sought revenge. Bismarck was hunted down by a huge combined fleet of British warships and aircraft, and famously sunk under a barrage of fire. And all told, 2,200 men were lost with her. In 2001, Hood's wreck was discovered lying in pieces on the sea floor, confirming a violent detonation of the aft magazines. Touchingly, her bell was spotted in the debris field and recovered, restored, and unveiled in 2016, some 75 long years after her loss. For decades now, debate has raged over the cause of the explosion, but regardless of its exact origin, the fact remains that 1,400 men went down with their ship that day. Many of them, young fathers, brothers, and sons, were lost in mere seconds on the day she sank, and Hood's twisted and mangled wreck is today their gravesite. And many of their last resting places, just as on Bismarck, are marked by pairs of boots on the seafloor. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please think about liking and subscribing to the channel. You can support my channel on Patreon. You'll find the link down in the description. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.